What do you do when you are chosen by God but forced to live as a fugitive? When the promise is clear, but your circumstances seem to contradict everything God has said. In today's reading, David is on the run, hiding in caves, surrounded by danger, yet refusing to take shortcuts that would secure his future. See, this is where true faith is revealed. So, my dear friends, welcome to Under the Word, where we daily read the scriptures not merely for knowledge or information, but for transformation and for formation. So let's jump in. Today's readings are 1 Samuel chapter 21 through 24, and then we read Psalm 84. And so as we continue in the books of Samuel, today we encounter once again that David's life has shifted dramatically. Right? He has been anointed king, but now lives as an outlaw. In fact, according to the Word Biblical Commentary and the ESV Study Bible, this section reveals the theology of righteous suffering and restrained power. You see, David is tested not by weakness, but by opportunity. Will he trust God's timing or seize control? So let's jump in. 1 Samuel 21. You see, David arrives at Nob and meets a priest, Amalek. So he is alone in this place when he meets him. In fact, the priest is a little caught off guard. He sees David was vulnerable and his life is in danger. And David receives a consecrated bread. So, in fact, the bread of the presence is what it's called, right? So, and we read about this in Leviticus chapter 24. And according to this law in Leviticus 24, the bread of the presence is reserved only for the priests. Yet it is here given to David in a moment of necessity. In fact, this event later becomes significant in the life and ministry of Jesus when he referenced it in Mark chapter 2, verses 25 and 26. In fact, illustrating that human needs does not nullify God's law, but reveals its deeper purpose. So David also takes the sword of Goliath. It's an ironic symbol of past victory now used for survival. But you see, but fear drives David further. He flees to Gath. This is the hometown of Goliath. The people recognized him and felt threatened by him. And so David pretends madness to escape. You see, this chapter shows David's humanity. He's fearful, he improvises, and then it shows his vulnerability. The reality is, my dear friends, you see, God's chosen servant is not portrayed as flawless, as this perfect being, but as dependent on God's provision. Right? And then we move to 1 Samuel 22. In this chapter, we read that David retreats to cave of Adullam, right? So there, amazing thing is there a group gathers around him. These are not elite military trained individuals. In fact, it says the distressed, the indebted, and also the so the discounted and the discontented as well. So this becomes the foundation of future kingdom. You see, God begins forming a people around his anointed king. While Saul descends even further. You see, when he learns that the priest aided David, he orders their execution. The Hebrew text here emphasizes the horror of this event in history. 85 priests are slaughtered, just immediately just killed. A family is annihilated, and only one child. right? Abithar escapes, and then he joins David. And this is the turning point. You see, Saul is no longer merely unstable, he's openly opposing God's order. In fact, according to some um, scholars of the Old Testament, and they reveal to us that this act demonstrates Saul's complete moral and spiritual collapse. And then now we move to 1 Samuel 23. Here, David continues living in dependence on God. Not independence, but in dependence on God. You see, when the Philistines attack Keilah, David seeks the Lord's guidance. In fact, here, uh, seeking the Lord's guidance, the Hebrew word is shalah ba Yahweh, which really just means to inquire of the Lord, the covenantal name of God. And this becomes a key theme in David's leadership. You see, unlike Saul, David does not act independently from God, but God directs David and delivers the city. And yet, even there, David is not safe. And God, even in the city. And yet, even there, David is not safe. And God, even in that place, as when David seeks the face of God, if the people will betray him, God reveals to him that the people of Keilah would, in fact, betray him to Saul. So David, afraid for his life, leaves the place. Yet there's a reunion that takes place, right? Jonathan finds David and strengthens him in the Lord and makes a covenant with him once again. He says, like, you certainly will be the king of Israel, and I'll be right there next to you. But here the word strengthens him in the Lord. In the Hebrew, in its original phrase, it reflects a spiritual encouragement grounded in God's promises. It was not just an emotional support or emotional encouragement. So he reminded him of God's faithfulness. He encouraged him to be grounded in God's promises. What a friend, right? But Saul continues pursuing David. But what is so beautiful, and what we read in this is like God's providence, right? Providentially, God provides. There was a turning point where Philistines rise and the news comes, and as Saul was encroaching on David, God provides through that. And so David can escape, right? So again, what does this teach us is that God preserves David again, not because of David's military skills, but God's promises will not be shortcut. And then we move to 1 Samuel chapter 24. And I believe this chapter presents one of the most profound tests of David's character. Saul enters a cave, completely unaware of David is inside. David's men see opportunity. In fact, if you remember, so you're reading, so they say to him, "Here is the day the Lord has delivered your enemy to him. Let's kill him." Right? To strike your enemy is what they tell him. From human perspective, this is tempting. This is the perfect moment. But we see David, from human perspective, this is tempting. This is the perfect moment. But we see David refuses. But he gets close enough and he cuts off a corner of Saul's robe, then is immediately convicted. Why? Because Saul is still the Lord's anointed. You see, David understands something critical. God establishes authority and God removes it. David does not seize the throne through violence, yet at the same time, he confronts Saul, not with force, but with truth, restraint, and absolute humility. Who have you come to hunt here? A dead dog? A flea is what he says. Humility. And Saul now recognizes David's kingship. He recognizes David's authenticity and humility. And character. In fact, he says to him, you are more righteous than I. In fact, he says to him, you are more righteous than I. And then he asks him, like, hey, I know now you're the true king. When you get into your kingship, please don't wipe out my lineage or my name out of my family. See, yet the narrative leaves illusion. You see, Saul's repentance is temporary. The contrast is complete, isn't it? Saul takes what he wants. David waits for what God has promised. And then we move to one of my favorite Psalms, Psalm 84. It shifts the focus from wilderness struggle to spiritual longing. I love what it says. How lovely is your dwelling place, O God, O Lord of hosts. See, this psalm expresses the deep desire for God's presence. The psalmist declares, my soul longs, yes, faints for the courts of the Lord. Here, the Hebrew word for longs, intense yearning, intense desire, wanting, craving, this deep appetite, thirst. This is not a casual interest, my dear friends. It is a deepest spiritual hunger for God. Verse 10 captures one of my favorite verses, honestly speaking. Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper, David, the psalmist says. You see, my dear friends, this stands in contrast of Saul's pursuit of power and control. True blessing is not found in position, but in proximity to the living covenantal God. What a powerful reading today. So all of these then, I believe these passages reveal a profound spiritual tension. Saul is king but collapsing. David lives in caves but walks in obedience. Saul sits on the throne but acts in rebellion. Then Psalm 84 lifts and shifts our eyes and our focus. The true goal is not safety, power, or success, but the very presence of God. The unifying truth is this: faithfulness is measured not by circumstances, but by obedience to God in those circumstances. David foreshadows Christ, the anointed king who suffers before reigning and became completely obedient, even obedient unto death, not any kind of death, but death on the cross. So you see, my dear friends, I believe wholeheartedly from today's reading, we can extract 4 critical lessons to apply to our lives. And this reading challenges us deeply in these 4 critical ways. First, it teaches us to trust God in uncertainty. You see, David's life does not look like success, but he is exactly where God has him. Second, it confronts our desire to control outcomes. See, David had the opportunity to take the throne, but chose obedience instead. Third, it calls us to see God's presence above all else in our lives. See, Psalm 84 reminds us that God himself is the ultimate reward. So finally, dear friends, it shows us the importance of restraint. You see, power is not proven by taking, but by refusing to take what God has not given. Let me repeat, it's not proven by taking, but by refusing to take what God has not given. So, my dear friends, in closing then, I just want to urge us, let us not rush ahead of God's timing. Let us not grasp for what he has not promised. Let us wait. Let us trust. Let us obey. Even, especially, I want to say, not even, especially when life feels uncertain, even when we are misunderstood, even when the path is difficult. Let us remain faithful because God sees, God preserves, God fulfills his promises in his perfect timing. Let us not rush ahead of him. So as always, I want to just remind us, let us continue to come back to the word over and over again. Let us remain patient. Let us remain grounded. As always, let us stay under the word. Again, thank you so much for watching this video. If it's been helpful, I encourage you to share with your friends. And I also want to thank you for spending part of your day with me. May God bless your day. Enjoy it. This is the day that the Lord has made. So be joyful and be glad in it. God bless you.